Hello everybody and welcome to Doors Open Day, Abbeys of the Scottish Borders. We're bringing you this on our series of We Love History Live. It's a question and answer and we'd really like to hear you pose questions and ask questions around what our speakers are going to be talking about. So that would be great. So you can ask on YouTube and Facebook. We would ask that when you ask questions, you make it known which you've used. And also on YouTube, you can access this through a Google account. So please get those questions going. Anything you've got to ask about Scottish Borders, Abbeys. And as you watch, you'll probably think about a wee bit more as well. So we look forward to receiving those. I'm really pleased to introduce two colleagues who are going to be talking with each other about this. I'm pleased to introduce my colleague Adrian Cox, who is a senior cultural resources advisor, and also my colleague Rory MacDonald, who is a senior designations officer. So hello there.
Hello, James.
Hello. Hi.
So I think we decided that maybe to set the scene, we'd have a discussion, or we'd introduce with the theme of what is an abbey, since we're going to be talking about abbeys. So maybe I could pose that question to Adrian in the first instance.
Thanks, James. Hello, everybody. Well, an abbey is it's a religious establishment, a community of monks or canons from a religious order, very often set up away from the busy mainstream world. They like to set their abbeys in peaceful, quiet locations so that the community could focus on the worship of God and focus on prayer. So the slide here shows Melrose Abbey, which is set in a wonderful picturesque landscape framed by the Eildon Hills there. It's in very fertile agricultural land. An abbey needed to be a little bit self-sufficient, needed to be able to grow crops, manage the land. Also, really importantly, needed a good water supply. So all of those things were important in the siting of an abbey. The other thing that we find with these abbeys is that there was often a pre-existing religious settlement. So there's very often a very good reason why that particular spot was chosen. Perhaps there'd been an early Christian settlement there, something like that. So these Borders Abbeys are a very important cluster of abbeys, all within a few miles of each other, often around the Tweed Valley. And this cluster is one of the most impressive, not just in the British Isles, but in the whole of Europe. If we've got a second slide there, there's sometimes there it is that we ask artists to provide us with reconstruction drawings, bringing these places to life. So here we have some monks in the chapel at Kelso. This space is in quite a ruinous condition. There's not very much of it left at all. But here we can see the monks worshipping. Prayer was such an important part of their lives, and the church was the real focus of their lives, as well as the cloister.
Rory, do you have anything to add to this? I'm sure you do.
I do. I mean, I think, as Adrian touched on, we're amazingly fortunate in the Scottish Borders to have four of the most spectacular remains of abbeys that we've got in Europe. So Jedburgh, Kelso, Melrose, and Dryburgh, each one a different order. So slightly differently run, slightly different functions, all broadly laid out in the same way. But for instance, Melrose run by the Cistercian order, which was very inward looking, whereas Jedburgh for the Augustinian order far more community focused, and so there were big differences in the way these abbeys actually worked. Melrose, for instance, the monks spent a very lot of the time in prayer and contemplation of God, and much of the actual running of the abbey would have been done by what was called lay brothers. So members of the community that were brought into the abbey to do tasks like farming and maintenance and things like that. Whereas in other abbeys, it would actually be the monks or the canons themselves that did these things. And the abbeys they weren't just houses of God. They were a focal point for the communities and acted in a much broader sense. For instance, there were places where royalty, the kings, would meet to hold court and discuss matters affecting the realm. There were places where you came on pilgrimage. So there was all kinds of different things that happened around these abbeys.
I think we get the idea that they're very multifaceted places.
Great centres of learning as well, and the monks would have been pioneers in industry in the medieval period. Things like coal mining, ironworking, agriculture, sheep farming. They all really started off with the abbey. So really important effect they had on the Scottish landscape in general.
I think that leads us quite nicely into our next question. But actually, we've had a question already from somebody across the pond, as they say, in New Jersey, and our person has asked, not counting war or battle, what do you think accounts for the fact that some buildings, for example, abbeys and others, survive intact and others fall into ruin or disappear completely?
Shall I try that one?
Yeah, go for it, Adrian.
One of the factors is that when these abbeys fell out of use as religious establishments, when the mass was banned, etc., and the monks had to stop living their usual monastic life, very often the monasteries themselves were continued in a function as a local parish church, and that's happened with 3 of these abbeys. The fourth one is Dryburgh, which was converted into something of a house and a design landscape. So if they continue in use, they don't suffer quite so badly from the ravages of time, people robbing stonework, etc. So continuation of a religious function is a really important factor. But you're right to say about warfare. Warfare was really important in how these abbeys fared and in their current condition, because they're right on the border. They were in the line of attack from cross-border warfare, and certainly in the mid-16th century, those attacks were so severe that some of these abbeys didn't then bounce back at all.
Yeah, I think we've jumped around fairly with the questions in terms of how we're going to ask them, but that's actually made it a bit more organic and kind of fluid as well. And I think it's interesting, you'll probably be able to tell us more, but the abbeys that are closer to the border, to the English border, seem to be the ones that, so perhaps Jedburgh was the one, it seems to have been attacked quite a lot of times.
Yeah, that's very true. And Jedburgh itself, because it had a castle, was also, quite a defensible base. And at one point, the French troops occupied it, and they fortified the abbey and built gun platforms, etc. So yes, they've all had their scrapes with cross-border warfare, definitely.
So the second question we were going to ask was. We've covered quite a lot of it, but I'm sure there's more to cover. Is what makes these places so special? What's that formula, that special formula that's imbued in these places that kind of just really makes them what we see? And I'll ask Rory that one first.
I think one of the, I think the big thing is just the buildings themselves. They are the most amazing pieces of architecture, and they've come to us from organically built over several hundred years. You can imagine in the 12th century when they were founded in what would be tiny little villages, and these huge stone structures full of amazing carving and detail arose. And it must have been truly spectacular to watch. And although they've suffered through border warfare and through robbing for other stone and all the things that have happened over the centuries, they still survive as amazing pieces of architecture. When you're in them, you really have a wow factor. And each of them is slightly different. For instance, you stand in the nave at Jedburgh, and it's colossal, huge building above you, towering over you. And it really can take your breath away. And then there's you wander around them looking, and some of them, for instance, have still got amazing pieces of carving that survived. I mean, one of the famous ones is the bagpipe playing pig, which is in Melrose. You know, but that's just a tiny little fun detail. But there's the amazing windows that were built, huge traceried windows, the columns that have got finely carved on them. They are just absolutely exquisite places to walk around, and you can't help but appreciate the craftsmanship of things that were built hundreds of years ago, but built, you know, and carved in a way that we may well struggle to do today if you know, we don't have the craft, you know, we don't really have the craftsmanship.
I think that's very true. And who's going to carve a bagpiping pig these days? You know?
Indeed.
What do you think, Adrian? What would your views be?
As Rory says, the architecture is wonderful, and at most of these sites, you can also see transitions from one architectural tradition to another. For example, at Jedburgh, there's some architecture which is Romanesque, and then it transforms within 40 to 50 years into Gothic architectural style, which is very light. It occupies the nave at Jedburgh. It's beautiful. As Rory says, it soars over the rest of the site. And so those things are really important. As well, we've got all the royal associations, you know, particularly with King David I, who had a hand in founding all of these abbeys. So he was a very pious king. We've also got Alexander II represented. James III, sorry, was crowned at one of the abbeys at Kelso, and also Robert the Bruce. His heart ended up being buried at Melrose. So we've got these real significant associations, and the sites themselves are a wonderful archaeological resource because they're so complete, because we've got churches, cloisters, outbuildings, parts of the monastic precinct. They're a wonderful resource for us to learn about monastic life from the 12th century, as Rory said, right through the centuries, 400 years or so in most cases.
I mean, you're right. They're just seeped with history. I mean, it's almost enough to make your brain explode what these places have seen and what they represent and what they demonstrate to us. We've had a good question actually that's just come in, if the two of you wouldn't mind thinking about it and answering it. So many castles, so many churches and other buildings become ruins and are not repaired. Is it cost or lack of interest or something else that they're not fully restored? And that maybe fits into what you were saying, Adrian, about archaeology. Ruins are considered romantic, but could they be repaired completely? Can somebody comment from a historical perspective?
Shall I pick that one up, Rory?
Yeah, go for it.
Start it off. We have a policy at Historic Environment Scotland of trying to intervene as little as we can in the fabric. And so what we're doing is conservation rather than restoration work. We want to conserve these places as they've been passed down to us, so that we can serve them authentically for future generations. So, and if we were to attempt to reconstruct them, no doubt we would get it wrong. Past generations have tried this in some places. The Victorians did this in some places, and we would criticize them for their approach now. So we're trying to conserve what's really special and significant about these sites so that we can pass them on to future generations and protect them for the future in the most authentic state possible, so that we preserve that significance.
I think, Rory, I've got a good question for you here, actually, before we move on to our next sort of subject matter. And unbeknownst to me, Rory told me today that he is the author of Christian Heritage in the Borders, which blew me away. So this is a good one. That's come in on Facebook. In Borders Abbeys, beyond warfare, how conscious were the people in these institutions that they were in Scotland or England, more in common with another monk at another abbey across the border than the rest of Scotland?
That is a good question. Yeah. I mean, I think they would have been very conscious of which country they were in, although these houses were founded from what were called mother houses often in other countries. For instance, Melrose was founded from Revo in Yorkshire. So there's a lot of cross. You'd be well aware of ties to other places, and all the abbeys themselves originated. The orders originated in France, and there would have been travel between the two, but they would have been very conscious. They were Scottish abbeys. I mean, many of the members of the abbeys would actually have come from the wealthier families of the aristocracy of Scotland. If you weren't for instance, the first son, so wouldn't inherit, you may have went into the church because it had a certain degree of prestige. So that there were, I think they were very conscious of where they came from. Although they were, and we kind of touched on this earlier, because they were, for instance, the wool trade was multinational. So they had probably a broader outlook than many of the institutions perhaps of the time. Although they were undoubtedly aware they undoubtedly were very Scottish.
And quite a nice juxtaposition, because they're insular, yet they have these kind of international relationships as well. Because we've had two questions which I probably can co-join into the one, was about, and I'm going to have problems saying this, did the Tyrannician, is that how one pronounces it?
Tyrannicians.
Thank you. Tyrannicians monks at Kelso, few abbey lands to Flemish wool merchants in the 12th century to raise sheep for wool for the Flemish textile trade. And if yes, are the monks likely to have transferred existing procedures to the other abbeys, i.e. Kilwinning?
There certainly was a big trade with Flanders, a big trade with wool trade. The abbeys themselves had monastic farms, which were called granges. So they actually farmed the land they were given themselves in quite a lot of instances. And we're fortunate in the Borders that there are actually the archaeological remains of some of these granges in the Cheviots. In the Tweed Valley near Melrose, there's the remains of what's a Vicaria, which was a cattle ranch. So we are I think a lot of it was done in house. Although they did, as we touched on in the previous question, have very strong ties internationally.
Okay, thank you both for that. I think one of the reasons we're doing Digital Doors Open Day for a reason, because we can't all get out and about, and because we're talking about such a visceral and picturesque, and you could throw any word you want to describe these places, beautiful. Maybe Adrian could give us, or could kick us off on a kind of virtual tour, and really sort of bring these places alive to us, as if we were there.
Yes, thanks, James. Let's maybe we could start with Melrose. Have we got an image of Melrose? There we go. Melrose is in this wonderful open landscape. It's framed by the Eildon Hills. It has wonderful church architecture, and as you can see in the picture there in the foreground, it also has very substantial remains of the cloistral buildings where the monks spent a lot of their time. The church was perhaps their focus. So as one walks into the site, you can walk right the way through the church. You'd start off in the nave, which was the part of the abbey church that was accessible to lay people for parishioners to worship. And then you'd pass through a screen, which is common to monastic churches. We can call it the pulpitum screen in this case. You pass through a screen, very ornate screen with ornate doorway, etc., and then into the monk's choir, which is even more ornately decorated. And Melrose, as I think Rory said earlier, has these just wonderful carvings everywhere, inside and outside of the church. So the key for visitors is to look up and look around you, because the carvings are just wonderful. Some of them are even quite playful. They're really the medieval stonemasons showing off their skills. And the slide on the screen now is the presbytery, looking straight up into the presbytery, which is the part of the church which accommodated the high altar, the religious focus of the church. And looking up, there are there's rib vaulting up there at the top, and a range of ceiling bosses on which you have different saints depicted. And they usually have accompanying symbols with them. So we've got St. Thomas, St. Andrew, there's one of the Holy Trinity in the middle, St. Paul and St. Peter are also represented. This was the height of sophistication of medieval stonemasons carving. And we know that some of the best of the carved architecture was associated with a Parisian stonemason, a Parisian master mason called John Morrow, who was working around about 1400, and his creations are just magnificent, really. So the church is a splendid thing. Moving outside of the church, Melrose also has a chapter house in which there's been quite a bit of archaeological investigation. David I's stepson, St. Waltheof, was buried in the chapter house, and he had an association with having performed miracles. And there's a story that when his coffin was opened some time after his death by workmen working on the chapter house, they looked into his coffin, and his body hadn't decayed at all, so miraculously well preserved. However, there were archaeological excavations in 1921 and once again in 1996, and several burials in the chapter house were revealed, and we can learn a lot about those. One of them was a heart burial, which has been associated with the heart burial of Robert the Bruce. So many visitors come to stand in that particular spot. Robert was the rest of his body was buried at Dunfermline Abbey, of course, but his heart was brought to Melrose and interred on the site here. So there's some wonderful places. Also, moving across the site towards the commendator's house, I think we've got a picture of that. There it is. This was a 15th century building which was converted into a house by the last commendator. And just to explain what a commendator is, a commendator was a royal appointee who took the role of an abbot, but was very often interested in business affairs and began to move away from the idea that he would live with the monks or the canons on the site. So the commendator's house is a well-preserved late 16th century conversion of a 15th century building, but it now houses a wonderful collection of artifacts, one of the best medieval collections anywhere in the country, of many things that were found in the Great Drain at Melrose. Wonderful objects. There's lots of ceramics, there's lots of metallic objects, floor tiles, window glass, everything you can think of. A huge resource for us to know about everyday life of the community that was living there. So tremendous, really.
Brilliant.
And that's Melrose. As Rory was saying, there are different aspects to these sites. At some sites, the cloistral range is particularly well preserved. At other sites, it's the church that survives best of all. And in each case, different parts of the Abbey precinct survive particularly well. Should we move on to Kelso?
Yes, that'd be good.
Do you want to chip in here, Rory?
Yeah, sure. So we're hopefully going to get a picture of coming up of Kelso. Kelso in some ways is, it's the least well preserved, or there's the least visible, although we know a lot about it through excavation. But when you cross the very fine bridge into Kelso, and you sweep around, and the big western tower, it still stands, survives. That's the biggest thing, and the main thing that we can still see of the Abbey. But Kelso is very unusual in having two towers. Most of the abbeys would have had one above the transept, which is where the nave met the choir. Melrose had two, and would have had all the other pieces of Abbey architecture. So it would have had the cloister being a kind of enclosed area that had many of the important buildings of the Abbey. So it would have had the chapter house where the monks would have got their daily instructions. It would have had their refectory where they ate. The warming house, which in some abbeys was the only room in the abbey with a fire. So the only warm room, which was, would have meant it was very cold during the winter. So in Kelso, we've got the grand western tower, which is intricately carved, part of the nave beyond it. But a lot of what we know about Kelso, we actually know through excavations in the 1970s, where we found remains of other buildings, including an infirmary, which was just what you'd say, it was a hospital. And that is another aspect of these abbeys. Some of the abbeys also cared for the sick, and we have and some through kind of travelling hospitals, some through infirmaries, which would look after their own the monks and canons, but also other people as well. So Kelso, as you come in, you've got that you come in, and you although there's less surviving than in the other abbeys, you come in and there's a huge tower above you which just soars above your head, and you look up and you can see there's at least four levels above, and then above that there's more to where the top of the tower would be where the bells were, and it's well, we'll touch on this a bit later because I know we're going to talk about it. But Kelso and the tower in Kelso's got one of my kind of favourite wee stories from the borders, and we'll kind of talk about that in a little while about the cultural context and why it's quite interesting. So Kelso's also interesting that there's now a memorial to the Dukes of Roxburgh where the kind of cloister would be, which kind of mimics nicely, although it's a Victorian, I think it's a Victorian creation. It mimics part of what would have been there. So it's quite a small amount within the area the Historic Environment Scotland owned. But just look over the fence and you see there's a wonderful old graveyard at Kelso, which would have possibly have been on the site of the original graveyard. So it's a really atmospheric entrance to what is one of the iconic kind of border towns, and Kelso being one of the first of the abbeys to be founded as well. So it's really quite special, even though there's not maybe as much to walk around as in some of the other ones.
I think you've really You sure? I think you've really explained again about that sense of identity that the towns that have grown up around them and that have taken stone from them, but their whole identity is bound with that place. But it's very much
absolutely
love. So sorry, Adrian, after you.
I was just going to say some of the best views of Kelso Abbey are from across the river Tweed, which is one of those. It's the river that three of these abbeys have in common with each other, and in fact, it's very central to the identity of Kelso. That image of the abbey from across the river is everywhere, isn't it? In the town, town's website and so on. It's funny that when you're in the centre of Kelso, you could look up and you really don't notice the abbey until you come across it, and then, as Rory says, it's suddenly there it is towering above you, the Great West Front.
What about, I'm conscious of time, but I think the chat's really interesting. So we've not really covered Dryburgh or Jedburgh in terms of this kind of talking about our sort of experience of it as if we were there on foot. maybe Adrian, you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, Jedburgh Abbey, for example, is another one which has amazing architecture, and again, this wonderfully light, airy Gothic architecture, particularly in the nave at Jedburgh. That's the image on the left there on your screen. It's extremely well preserved, although roofless. The rest of the building is pretty well intact, and this again is to do with it having been reused as a post-Reformation church. And then it has this is the one that's not on the River Tweed, but it's on a river called the Jedwater, and the site slopes downwards towards the Jedwater and has been built up in a series of terraces. Must have been a lot of work for the original builders to put this together, but archaeological excavation in the mid-1980s revealed the cloistral buildings, or many of them, including the very substantial South Range buildings and their undercrofts and their cellars. So that's the picture on the right there. Some of these very substantial ashlar remains, very ornately decorated in some cases. There's an abbot's residence. There's the chapter house, which Rory's spoken about, with burials. All of the ranges are surrounded. They surround a cloister garden, and at Jedburgh, the garden has been reconstructed. So lots of plants that would have had a use in the medieval period, for example, for medicine or for cooking, for culinary use, can't say that word, would have been grown there, and have been recreated on the site with a juniper tree, the tree of life, in the middle. So it's a lovely space to walk around, actually, and really does give you a feel for the whole complex. Perhaps at Jedburgh more than anywhere else, we get this full range of monastic buildings. Should we move on to Dryburgh, James?
Yes, we probably crank it up slightly.
Quick spin around Dryburgh. Dryburgh Abbey is very very picturesque, and as you can see by the photo that's coming up now, sits directly by the Tweed. It's on a bend in the River Tweed. It's a lovely setting, even today, very, very peaceful. We know that it was founded around 1150 by Hugh de Morville, who was the Constable of Scotland at one point, a very aristocratic, very, very rich gentleman. He brought monks from Alnwick Priory, and its later history, actually, it became a design landscape. The Earl of Buchan bought it in the 17th century and transformed it into what he called a temple of Caledonian fame. So he introduced lots of specimen trees. He landscaped the site, introduced some rather odd, rather quirky elements to the site as well. And it's a wonderful, wonderful site to walk around, actually. The Tweed is right there. If you stand next to the Tweed for long enough, you'll see fish leaping. You can hear birds sing, and dogs barking as well. And it's a very beautiful site. It also, like the other abbeys, it has very ornate architecture. Fragments of the church survive, especially the north transept, and the chapter house is a very rare survival. There is painted decoration in the chapter house, which is extremely rare. Early decoration, which has posed us some interesting conservation problems over the years. It's partly subterranean space, but extremely interesting place to walk around is Dryburgh. Lovely site.
So I think from a good place, you just mentioned conservation, and it's clear that you and Rory are absolutely fascinated by this subject matter, and that you have a real love of it. So why would that be, and what are we doing now to conserve, preserve? You mentioned slightly when we came to that question about picturesque ruins and what happened in the past. Maybe you could give us a snapshot, Adrian and Rory, of what's happening now.
Shall I start off? Our very, very good team of conservation professionals constantly checks all of the monuments that we look after right across Scotland, including these abbeys, for structural soundness and integrity, and they make repairs and adjustments as needed. So a lot of their work is very fine. It's the kind of traditional techniques that medieval masons themselves would recognize. It's working with traditional mells, the kind of mason's hammer that they'll use. A lot of it is high level work. Some of it involves repointing some of the stonework or adding to the pointing with lime mortar, a traditional method again. I love working with these guys because I learned so much about the care and conservation of buildings and the principles behind it. And because these are all sandstone buildings, they do tend to be weathered from time to time. They're exposed to the elements. They're roofless, of course. Water ingress into the fabric is the thing that quite often causes the most damage if it's not arrested. So these guys are really good professionals. It's so great working alongside them to look after these really important buildings. There's another slide we have of another innovative technique that we've been using at Melrose, for example, and other sites as well across the country. This is soft capping, where we have a wall which is again exposed to the rainfall and the snow, etc. If we place a capping of clay and turf over the top, it's a really nice sustainable way of protecting the wall from water ingress. So this particular one is at Melrose Abbey, where some of the graveyard walls survive very well, but soft capping is the way to stop the water getting into those and causing damage. So lots of different techniques. Our teams are on the case all the time, looking after these abbeys for future generations.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, isn't it? It's future generations. It's the now, but it's going forward, and you know the significance that we attach to these and how we want to hand these over to future generations, legacy. So Rory, maybe if we're talking about legacy, we were maybe going to discuss about what have you got a funny anecdote or story, or was Kelso maybe where you were leaning towards?
Yeah, I don't know if funny's the right word, but it touches on several of the themes we've talked about. It touches on the kind of border warfare. It touches on the why the Abbeys are in the state they're in now. But one of the stories that I always found fascinating is actually pretty near the end of the Abbey, 1545, and the Earl of Hertford is sent north into Scotland with 12,000 troops by King Henry VIII, part of his rough wooing. And it's a multinational force. It's not just English. There's Irish. There's Spaniards. There's folk from Italy and the Balkans. And he sends one of his instructions is he wants them to fortify Kelso Abbey as a base. So they turn up to the Abbey to find there's already 100 Scottish troops there and 12 monks. So it's the Spaniards that have been tasked with taking the Abbey, and they attack the Abbey, and on the first day they're not really getting anywhere. So eventually they bring up their cannons and blow a hole in the wall, and the defenders are all forced to head back into the tower, which I mentioned, the big tower. And so they're in there and they defend it for the rest of the day. And they've got the Scots have got musketeers who're shooting at the Spaniards, but that night they get the bell ropes, and 12 or 13 of the defenders scale down the outside of the tower to try and escape. 2 are caught and killed, but the others get away. And the next day, the Signor de Gamboa, who is in charge of the Spaniards, gets a little bored with this and actually brings in his heavy guns and blows the doors of the tower open, and they swarm in, and that's the end of the defenders. And rather than then fortifying the place as King Henry had asked the Earl of Hertford to do, the Spaniards decided actually it wasn't really worth fortifying it, because there's the remains of Roxburgh Castle half a mile up the Tweed, and they think that'd be a better place for a fort. So what the Spaniards then do is they strip all the lead off the roof, take away all the the goods, all the communion gear and things like that, ship it off down to England and take it away as booty. And I always think it's not a fun story, but you could imagine it would make a cracking little TV, TV kind of show. One of these historical reenactments. And that's only 15 years before the Reformation, when the abbeys essentially stopped being able to act in the way they wanted, and so that was effectively the end of the abbey. And it's a bit of a it's slightly, I think, bizarre that the end of the abbey comes from these Spanish troops, ransacking it and making off with all the goodies.
That is bizarre.
Yeah.
Adrian, I'm going to pass over to you, and then I'm very embarrassingly going to run out of my room to get a charge lead as you're telling us all, because my computer's about to switch itself off. So over to you, Adrian.
I was just going to mention how these abbeys are also a wonderful archaeological resource. I'm involved in some of the research that goes on. We do a lot of research. We're always learning something new about the abbeys, adding to our knowledge of the everyday lives of the communities that worked and served there. And certainly each of these abbeys has something different to offer. There's been, as we've mentioned as we've been going along, there's been some quite major archaeological interventions and excavations which have produced wonderful results. At Jedburgh, we've got this wonderful collection, including early medieval artifacts, the Jedburgh comb, which is perhaps dates from about 1100, wonderfully ornate thing carved from walrus ivory. And also the Jedburgh shrine, which is even earlier shrine fragments. So and of course at Melrose, that wonderful collection, which is pretty holistic, really. It really covers many aspects of everyday life in an abbey. So they're just a terrific research resource, and it helps us. All of this information helps us to protect their significance. So whenever there's an intervention on the site, we make sure we record it, we monitor any sort of groundbreaking works, and that really helps us to confirm the significance all the time of these sites, and helps us to protect them and to explain them better to the public, which is very important, of course, to get people to value them and identify with them.
And talking about explaining to the public, I've left the best to the last. I've got a few questions that have mounted up, but I didn't want to sort of break your. We were chatting away quite well, so maybe I can fire a few questions off, and be a nice way to end our chat. So we've got Jenny, who's asked, with agriculture and coal mining being of importance to the monks, were they the civil engineers of the day? I'll direct that to Rory.
The monasteries, the abbeys, were the repository of a lot of crafts. So yes, architecture, civil engineering, agriculture, scripture, metalworking, and I think the simple answer is yes. Yeah.
Sorry, I've just shut down what I didn't want to shut down. I've got all confused at running to get that adapter. Here's one for you. Here is one for you, Adrian. David would like to know, what was the impact of the reivers on these abbeys?
This is kind of late on in the history. Certainly there's, I think perhaps all of the historic sites in the borders have been impacted in some way by reivers' activities. We were mentioning agriculture and livestock rearing was really important to the abbeys. Sheep farming was so important to Melrose, the wool trade, etc. And I guess reivers' activities certainly changed that world in the borders for us. Different activities going on, and by this time the monastic life had largely come to an end. But certainly later on in the history of these buildings, it would have been a significant factor. Rory probably knows more about this than me.
It certainly would have. I think one of the big impacts of the reivers, and reivers, for those that don't know, are essentially border bandits or brigands. The people that gave words like blackmail and bereave to the English language. The main issue was that in the kind of the border counties, so Dumfries and what is now Dumfries and Galloway and Scottish borders, and Cumbria and Northumberland were fairly lawless. So you can imagine the fact they were fairly lawless, because there was so much of this border raiding going on, certainly would have impacted. And the reivers were big cattle rustlers and sheep rustlers. So you can imagine the big flocks and big herds that the Abbeys had would have been, juicy targets for the reivers.
Oh, so the reivers were God, and godliness was yeah.
No, not really.
Not much has changed, but moving on quickly. Cynthia would like to know, in terms of hierarchy in wars and battles, where did abbeys fall within this? Were they as highly valued targets, and did abbeys try and defend themselves? I'll fire that to Rory first.
Yes, they were well sought after targets. Because they had a great deal of wealth in them, and associated with them. So obviously, as booty, as prizes for raiding and in warfare, they were targets. They were also defended, as Adrian said earlier. Jedburgh Abbey was fortified by the French at one point, on behalf of the Scots in the 16th century. As I said, Henry VIII had tasked the Earl of Hertford to look at Kelso as a place to be fortified. So yes, they were. I mean, they were big stone buildings, so they did lend themselves to a degree to fortification. And obviously, given they were targets, yeah, they were certainly defended.
Because they were obviously religious settlements. When a king's army attacked or burned an abbey, it's not infrequently the king in question then gave a grant of money for repairs. Richard III certainly did this. So those who were attacking the abbeys were conscious of that their booking a place in heaven could be affected by this. So certainly there's. It's quite a long and complex thing, isn't it? Cross-border warfare and its effect on individual abbeys.
This is a really good one to maybe end on in terms of interpretation and understanding and recreation. Is the digital medium, and in terms of recreation of spaces and getting that real set. I mean, what was really interesting with that image you showed, Adrian, was how colourful that space was that the monks were in, because we don't necessarily get that aspect from walking around the ruins anymore, of how, brightly coloured these places and ornate and decorative. Are we doing kind of digital work on that to try and get a sense of that?
Yeah, we commission artists who use various different media to depict these very important sites right across Scotland. And as you say, James, very often it's to bring out the decorative nature, the painting, the white walls, the features picked out in red and orange and yellow, those sorts of things that visitors don't actually see physically when they come to the sites. They tend to see bare stone walls. I mentioned Dryburgh having some painting surviving in the chapter house, but generally it's very largely gone. So we base it all very, very carefully on research, though, so that we're trying to get these images that are produced as authentic and realistic as possible. It's very often a best guess based on the current state of our knowledge, which is always changing. The knowledge is always increasing. So this one, for example, the remains in question, the physical remains on site, are very, very fragmentary. But we've recreated this scene to try to bring that back to life. As we often say, a picture paints 1,000 words, and this kind of brings those sites to life. And shows just how important these places are, and how special and significant they are, and it helps us really to explain these fantastic architectural spaces in a way that is even more amazing. And as you touched on, James, the digital means of doing this now is these things are improving all the time. We can use different media, and people, when they're learning about these sites, will respond to different ways of revealing them, whether it's digital or whether it's a really nice artistic portrait. We can use different media, and so that finds its way into our on-site interpretation and guidebooks, etc.
Thank you. That's I mean, I would like to say a big thank you to the pair of you, sorry. Sharing your immense knowledge and passion about these buildings, which at the moment we're maybe not experiencing in the way that we could do, but that won't be that far off, hopefully. And they are fascinating, and they're in such a little cluster that you could just have a day out and visit all four if you wanted to. And obviously watch this YouTube beforehand for your expert knowledge, so you'd be ready to go. But yeah, I'd like to just say thank you so much for giving your time and your expertise. And I'd also like to say thank you to everybody for tuning in and asking some really good questions, really provoking. And another thing just to ask everybody watching is that we are doing a survey, which will be on the bottom of the chat on YouTube, and we're asking you whether you've enjoyed these live stream events that we've done of late, and whether you think we should do more, and we'd really value your views and opinions. So without further ado, I'd just like to say thank you from myself as well, and I'm sure my guests can say thank you for themselves.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It's been fun.
And that's us signing out. So thanks.
Bye.